Episode 1: The Beast Nobody Wanted. The Republic Aviation Factory in Farmingdale, New York, 1941. Engineers stared at their creation with a mixture of pride and concern. What rolled out of that hangar wasn't just big for a fighter plane, it was enormous. 7 tons of metal, the heaviest single-engine fighter ever built. The P-47 Thunderbolt looked less like a sleek interceptor and more like a flying tank with wings, and nobody wanted it. The Army Air Forces had asked Republic for a lightweight interceptor, something nimble that could dance with German fighters at high altitude. What they got instead was this massive brute, powered by an engine so large it needed a turbocharger buried deep in the fuselage, connected by ducts that ran the entire length of the aircraft. The cockpit sat so far back that pilots joked they needed binoculars to see the propeller. Test pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, though some claimed it stood for the milk jug its stubby fuselage resembled. Either way, it wasn't a compliment. Early reports were brutal. The P-47 was heavy, it climbed slowly, and in low-altitude dogfights it handled like a truck. Compared to the graceful P-51 Mustang or the nimble Spitfire, the Thunderbolt seemed like a mistake, an expensive dead end that consumed resources America couldn't afford to waste. But the engineers at Republic knew something others didn't. They'd built this aircraft to survive. Every design choice that made it heavy also made it nearly indestructible. That massive radial engine up front, an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp that could take dozens of hits and keep running. Those thick wings, strong enough to carry bombs and rockets that would tear lighter aircraft apart. That spacious fuselage. Room for 8.50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any fighter in the sky. The P-47 wasn't designed to be loved, it was designed to win. Episode 2, Baptism by Fire. Spring 1943. The 8th Air Force in England faced a crisis. American bombers were getting slaughtered over Germany. B-17s and B-24s flew in massive formations, their own guns providing mutual protection, but German fighters picked them apart anyway. The Luftwaffe had figured out the formula: attack from head-on where the bombers had the fewest guns, focus fire until one went down, then move to the next. Bomber crews were dying at horrific rates. Some squadrons lost half their men before completing the required 25 missions. The math was simple and terrible. At current loss rates, the strategic bombing campaign would collapse before it achieved anything meaningful. The P-47 Thunderbolts arrived at English airfields in early 1943, and the reception was ice cold. Fighter pilots wanted Spitfires or P-51s. They'd heard the rumors about the Jug: heavy, slow to climb, poor visibility from the cockpit. When they first strapped into those cramped cockpits and fired up those massive engines, many thought their fears confirmed. The Thunderbolt didn't feel like a fighter. It felt like flying a locomotive. Then they took it into combat. The first thing pilots discovered was speed. The P-47 might climb like a pregnant cow, but once it got altitude, it dove like a meteor. That massive weight that made it sluggish going up made it absolutely devastating going down. Thunderbolts could dive faster than anything the Germans flew. FW-190s and BF-109s that tried to escape by diving found themselves overtaken by screaming Jugs, those 850s ripping them apart. The second discovery was durability. German cannon shells that would shred a Spitfire or Mustang just made the P-47 angry. That big radial engine absorbed punishment that would destroy liquid-cooled engines. Pilots came back with cylinders shot off, control surfaces shredded, holes you could stick your head through, and the Thunderbolt kept flying. One pilot counted over 200 bullet and shell holes in his aircraft after a mission. He landed it safely. Stories spread through the squadrons. A P-47 that lost 6 feet of wing and made it home. Another that took a 20 shell through the cockpit, wounding the pilot, but flew 200 miles back to England. The Thunderbolt was building a reputation. It brought its pilots home. But the real revelation came when someone decided to see what happened if you pointed this 7-ton monster at the ground and didn't pull up until the last possible second. Episode 3, The Discovery. It happened by accident, as many great discoveries do. A P-47 pilot, separated from his formation over France, spotted a German truck convoy. Low on fuel, knowing he couldn't make it back to England anyway, he decided to take them with him. He pushed the nose over and dove. What happened next changed the war. The Thunderbolt accelerated in that dive like nothing he'd ever experienced. The airspeed indicator wound up past 500 miles per hour. Whole aircraft shook and roared. German soldiers in those trucks looked up to see what must have seemed like the end of the world. 7 tons of American fighter screaming down at them at terminal velocity. 8 machine guns erupting in a sustained burst that turned the road into a kill zone. He pulled up, barely, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, the wings bending but holding. Behind him, the convoy was destroyed. Trucks burned, men scattered, chaos reigned, and he'd barely used any ammunition. The pilot made it back to England on fumes. He filed his report, expecting a reprimand for the unauthorized attack. Instead, his commander asked him to repeat the maneuver to teach others. Within weeks, P-47 squadrons were experimenting with ground attack tactics. Within months, it became standard doctrine. The Thunderbolt had found its calling. Everything that made it a mediocre dogfighter made it a perfect ground attack aircraft. That weight that hurt its climb rate made its dives unstoppable, and its gun platform stable. Those thick wings could carry bombs, first 500-pounders, then 1,000-pounders, eventually up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance. The rugged construction that seemed like over-engineering for a fighter became essential armor when flying through ground fire. That big engine that guzzled fuel gave it the power to pull out of dives that would have torn other aircraft apart. The Army Air Forces began retrofitting P-47s with bomb racks and rocket rails. They added more armor around the cockpit. They taught pilots new tactics: dive bombing, skip bombing, low-level strafing runs. The Thunderbolt transformed from an escort fighter into a multi-role aircraft that could protect bombers at altitude, then drop down to attack anything that moved on the ground. German soldiers began to fear the sound of that big radial engine. They called it Die Jug, adopting the American nickname. When you heard that distinctive roar, you ran. You didn't look up, you didn't try to fight back, you just ran for the nearest cover and prayed. Episode 4, The Killing Machine. By late 1944, the P-47 had become the Luftwaffe's nightmare and the Wehrmacht's terror. The statistics tell part of the story. Thunderbolts destroyed more ground targets than any other Allied aircraft. Thousands of locomotives, tens of thousands of trucks and tanks, countless buildings and bridges, but numbers don't capture what it felt like to be on the receiving end. German accounts describe the Thunderbolt attacks as apocalyptic. The aircraft would appear suddenly, often diving from directly overhead where they were hardest to spot. The sound came first, that distinctive roar of the R-2800 engine at full power, a sound that German soldiers learned to recognize instantly. Then the scream of the dive, the airframe shaking and howling as it plummeted earthward. Then the guns, 8.50 caliber machine guns, synchronized, pouring out over 100 rounds per second combined. The M2 Browning was already one of history's great weapons. 8 of them firing together created a cone of destruction that obliterated everything in its path. The rounds could penetrate light armor, shred trucks, kill men in foxholes. Tracers marked every fifth round, creating streams of fire that seemed to reach from sky to earth. And if the guns weren't enough, there were the bombs. P-47s carried them in every configuration. Single 500-pounders under each wing, a massive 1,000-pounder centerline, clusters of smaller bombs, napalm canisters that turned roads into rivers of fire. Pilots developed skip bombing techniques, releasing bombs at low altitude so they'd bounce into targets like deadly stones skipping across water. The rockets came later, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets mounted on underwing rails. Less accurate than bombs but psychologically devastating, they whooshed from the wings trailing smoke, impacting with explosions that could flip tanks. German soldiers reported that rocket attacks were the worst, the sound of them launching, the smoke trails arcing down, the uncertainty of where they'd hit. But the real weapon was the combination. A Thunderbolt attack wasn't just guns or just bombs or just rockets. It was all of them, in sequence, multiple aircraft working together. The first plane would strafe, forcing everyone to take cover. The second would drop bombs on the covered positions. The third would rocket anything that survived. Then they'd circle back and do it again and again until nothing moved. German commanders tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They moved supplies at night, but P-47s adapted, flying dusk and dawn patrols. They dispersed their columns, but that just slowed movement to a crawl. They increased anti-aircraft defenses, mounting 20-37 guns on every vehicle, but the P-47's armor and durability meant it could absorb hits that would down other aircraft. Some German units tried fighting back aggressively, concentrating fire on attacking Thunderbolts. Occasionally it worked. The P-47 wasn't invincible. Usually it just marked your position for the next wave. And even when they hit a Thunderbolt, even when they saw pieces fly off or smoke pour from the engine, the damn thing often just kept flying, kept attacking, limped back to base and landed safely. The psychological impact was devastating. German morale on the Western Front collapsed in part because of the Thunderbolt. Soldiers felt helpless, unable to move during daylight, unable to fight back effectively. The constant threat of attack from above created a grinding stress that wore men down faster than combat itself. Episode 5, The Jug's Legacy. When the war ended, the P-47 Thunderbolt had flown more missions than any other American fighter. It had destroyed more ground targets than all other Allied fighters combined. Of the 15,636 Thunderbolts built, they'd collectively claimed over 11,000 enemy aircraft destroyed, mostly on the ground, where the P-47 excelled at catching them. But the real measure of the Thunderbolt's success was simpler: pilot survival. The P-47 had the lowest loss rate of any American fighter in Europe. Pilots who flew it had better odds of completing their tour and going home. That rugged construction, that massive engine, that ability to absorb punishment and keep flying, it saved thousands of lives. German soldiers who survived the war remembered the Thunderbolt with a respect bordering on awe. In memoirs and interviews, they described it as the weapon they feared most, more than artillery, more than tanks, more than strategic bombers. The Thunderbolt could find you anywhere, strike without warning, and there was almost nothing you could do about it. The P proved that the best weapon isn't always the most elegant or the most loved. Sometimes it's just the one that works, that survives, that brings its people home while destroying the enemy. Republic Aviation's engineers had built a fighter nobody wanted that became the ground attack aircraft everybody needed. The Jug earned its fearsome reputation one mission at a time, one destroyed target at a time, one pilot brought safely home at a time. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't graceful, but when German soldiers heard that engine roar and looked up to see that massive silhouette diving from the clouds, they knew exactly what was coming: death from above, American style. Heavy, unstoppable, and absolutely terrifying,